Sarah grew up in a house where the air seemed to be distributed unevenly. Her father, a man with a deep voice and a gaze that could freeze an entire room, wordlessly decided which of his daughters deserved applause and which should get used to living in the shadows. From a young age, she understood that no matter how hard she tried, praise was never reserved for her. At 10, she received a used bicycle, with rust stains on the handlebars and a seat that pinched her clothes with every pedal. Stroke. She accepted it silently, smiling like someone grateful for leftovers on a cleared table. That same day, Emma, her younger sister, debuted a shiny new bicycle with metallic rims that gleamed in the sun and a bell that her father proudly rang in front of the neighbors. Sarah didn't cry, but she cherished the scene like an invisible scar. It wasn't the object that hurt, but the public proof that one daughter deserved celebration and the other, resignation. Over the years, the differences ceased to be a surprise and became routine. When Sarah arrived with impeccable report cards, filled with perfect grades, her father barely looked up from his newspaper to murmur a dry, emotionless, "Well done," as if congratulating a stranger. However, when Emma drew a messy child's drawing, he treated it like a museum piece. He had it framed and hung in the living room, right above the sofa, for all visitors to see. Sarah, barely 12 years old, understood that in her house, worth wasn't measured by merit or effort, but by a favoritism that would never change. She learned to keep quiet, to swallow her disappointment, and to collect memories as silent evidence of a trial that had yet to be dated. As a teenager, that wound deepened. In her senior year of high school, Sarah was chosen as the senior speaker, a hard-earned honor. She rehearsed the speech dozens of times, walking down the aisle in worn socks with a folded notebook in her pocket. The central line spoke of quiet, dignity, the kind that doesn't ask permission to exist. On the day of the ceremony, she glanced several times toward the row reserved for family members, but her father's seat remained empty, neatly empty. At that very moment, he was at a neighborhood theater, holding a cheap bouquet for Emma, who was dancing in the third row. Sarah spoke firmly, received heartfelt applause from teachers and classmates, and as she left, her mother told her, "He sees you in his own way." That phrase stuck with her like a splinter, because for Sarah, not seeing her was precisely the way. When she got to college, she stopped asking for permission to grow. With the patience of a watchmaker, she applied for scholarships, collected letters of recommendation, and accepted partial financial aid. She covered the rest with 3 jobs: waitressing in the afternoons, assistant in a drab office in the mornings, and math tutoring at night. Every dollar had a purpose: tuition, secondhand books with other people's, underlining, a small room with a narrow bed and a lamp that buzzed when it was hot. Meanwhile, Emma jumped from major to major like someone switching playlists: communications, design, psychology, and back to communications. Her father called it finding herself and wrote checks totaling more than $100,000. The scales had never been so unbalanced, and Sarah knew it. One day, Sarah decided to give her father a vintage watch she had secretly restored with a local watchmaker. He had replaced the strap, polished the crystal, and carefully adjusted the mechanism. She gave it to him with excitement, hoping for at least a gesture of appreciation. He murmured a distracted "thank you" and left it in a tray of papers. Days later, Emma showed up with a cheap ceramic mug with the misspelled "Best Dad." Her father photographed it, posted it on social media, and wrote, "My greatest treasure." It was in this brutal contrast that Sarah made a profound decision. Her life would no longer be measured on the skewed scale of her family, but in the peace of closing her eyes knowing that nothing had been handed out. Meeting David was like finding a firm foothold in the middle of a wobbly bridge. He didn't arrive with speeches, but with a calmness that contrasted with the anxiety of the world. An engineer by profession, accustomed to solving problems without raising his voice, he listened more than he spoke. The first time they went out, Sarah told him about her 3 jobs: the reheated coffees, and the lamp that never stopped buzzing. For the first time, someone saw her without comparing her to Emma, without using her as a mirror. When they announced their engagement, Sarah thought she'd found a refuge. Her father, true to form, reacted coldly. "Will I have to pay for this?" No congratulations or hug, just the dryness of an accountant reviewing accounts. It was a cruel reminder that, even at her happiest, recognition was a denied luxury. Emma was quick to claim center stage at the wedding as well. She demanded to be a bridesmaid after Sarah had already chosen Rachel, her childhood friend, who knew every twist and turn of her story. The refusal ignited a dull fire. From then on, Emma began to inject small objections into every detail: that the flowers were dull, that the DJ's playlist was outdated, that the chocolate cake wasn't photogenic. She spoke as if she were the event's producer, and the father nodded, repeating phrases that sounded like they were his own. Sarah made a mental note of each intrusion, not to hold a grudge, but to understand that her patience could no longer serve as a doormat. The pressure mounted during the fittings. Emma arrived at the boutique with the self-confidence of someone who knows no limits and asked to see something white, simple but striking. She smiled at the mirror in a long-sleeved lace dress, did a minimal turn, and said the rules were for insecure brides. The salespeople exchanged glances. Rachel pursed her lips, and Sarah felt that knot in her stomach she'd known since she was a child, the certainty that anything inappropriate would become a spectacle. Her father, upon hearing this, didn't stop her. On the contrary, he repeated that his youngest daughter deserved to feel special. It was the perfect prelude to a scene that no label could justify. On the eve of the wedding, a luncheon that was supposed to be peaceful turned into a dress rehearsal for the intolerable. The father raised his glass and, instead of toasting his soon-to-be-wed daughter, spoke of starting to save for Emma's big wedding. The words fell like cutlery to the floor, metallic, cold, embarrassing. Sarah held her gaze, not out of pride but for self-pity, and David brushed his hand under the table as if to say, "I'm here." Rachel, with her characteristic diplomacy, changed the subject. The mother looked at her plate, trapped in a silence that had become customary. No one else said anything, but everyone understood that the next day would not forgive distractions. The wedding day smelled of fresh flowers and promise. Sarah let them adjust her veil, took a deep breath, and chose to believe that, for a few hours, life could be simple. When Emma appeared in a white dress, bouquet in hand, and bridal hair, the air in the foyer changed temperature. The makeup artist blinked. One of the bridesmaids dropped a hairpin that sounded like a full stop. Behind her, the father announced in a solemn voice that, after escorting Sarah, he would also walk with Emma, so everyone knows how much I love her. It wasn't love, Sarah thought. It was a right of power. And she decided, without tears, that her answer would come when she made the most noise. The ceremony was a neat disarray. Sarah walked arm in arm with her father with the dignity of someone who owes no attention to any glance. She reached the altar next to David, and as the murmur subsided, she saw the father retrace his steps, take Emma by the arm, and lead her down the same aisle with identical solemnity. A guest cleared his throat, another looked down, someone took a photo no one would want to remember. David squeezed Sarah's hand, and she felt her entire past, bicycles, newsletters, forgotten watches, holding her back, keeping her upright. Humiliation became building material. A heavy brick, yes, but useful if you know where to put it. The reception was the second act. Emma circulated among the tables as hostess, occupying the death center of each family photo and distributing smiles as if she charged for them. The father took the microphone, 2 formal sentences for Sarah, a brief pause, and then a lengthy eulogy for Emma, his greatest pride. The room filled with timid applause and held breaths. Sarah stood with surgical calm, asked for the microphone, and unleashed a story she could no longer postpone. The rusty bike versus the new one, the ignored grades, the empty seat at her graduation, the abandoned vintage clock. She showed on her phone the recent transfer of $25,000 for Emma. The murmur turned to silence. "Today is the last day you will set foot in my life," she said, took David's hand, and left. If you're reading this far, tell us where you're following us from. Sometimes saying, "Here I am," is another way of seeing and being seen. It wasn't a gesture to gain clicks. It was the most honest way to open a conversation that had been denied to her since she was a child. The room erupted as soon as Sarah walked through the door. Emma threw herself to the floor, sobbing wildly, screaming that she had been betrayed, like an actress in a cheap tragedy. The father banged his clenched fist on the table, accusing his eldest daughter of having committed the greatest cruelty. The mother, on the other hand, collapsed in a chair, unable to sustain the charade. The guests immediately divided. Some discreetly approached Sarah to congratulate her on her courage. Others whispered that she had destroyed the family. That same evening, Sarah's phone filled with messages. Cousins applauding her, aunts accusing her of being cruel, friends sending videos of Emma parading in white as if she were the bride. The truth was etched on every device, and she could no longer disguise it. In the following days, Emma tried to rewrite the story. She posted on social media that it had all been a misunderstanding, that the white dress was just a personal style, and that Sarah had reacted out of jealousy. She uploaded posed photos with frozen smiles and phrases seeking sympathy. But the videos circulated quickly. There was the father taking her arm as if surrendering her. There was the awkward applause. There were the faces of the guests averting their gaze. The evidence was irrefutable. Sarah chose silence as her response, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that the truth had already been told. She learned that sometimes victory lies not in speaking louder, but in letting the facts speak for you. A couple of months later, an envelope arrived in her mailbox. The shaky handwriting and the scent of old perfume made her pause before opening it. It was a handwritten letter from her mother, confessing that she had been an accomplice by omission for years. She said that keeping quiet was easier than confronting her father, but now, living under the same roof with Emma, she had discovered the extent of his manipulations. "I thought protecting her meant keeping silent, and now I know I abandoned you," she wrote. Sarah read the letter several times until tears erased some of the ink. It wasn't a complete forgiveness, but it was a start. He agreed to meet her at a discreet cafe. They hugged for a long time, spoke briefly, and in that silence, a seed of reparation was planted. Meanwhile, the father and Emma sank into a vicious cycle. Emma lurched from failure to failure, convinced that a rescue was always just around the corner. The father, with gray hair and a hunched back, worked overtime and took out impossible loans to support his favorite daughter's whims. The neighborhood, which had previously treated them with respect, began to view them with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Sarah learned this news from a distance, with the calm of someone watching someone walk into quicksand. She didn't intervene, because she had understood that some battles aren't fought. They are abandoned to save oneself. With David, life acquired firm walls and open windows. They bought a modest house with a small garden, where they planted rose bushes that bloomed with the first rain. On Sundays, they had barbecues and invited neighbors and friends, celebrating without competition and sharing laughter that lasted longer than any speech. Sarah no longer replayed old scenes in her sleep. The empty graduation seat, the forgotten clock, the cheap cup turned treasure. Those memories had lost their edge. They no longer cut. They barely made a mark. Tatir. That thornless space. Her work became lighter, her laughter less shy, and her future, for the first time, a possible promise. One day, while hanging lights on the patio for a summer dinner party, Sarah found herself humming along without realizing it. That low melody was proof that life had changed its tone. She placed mismatched glasses on the table, David's favorites, and reflected that sometimes the bravest thing to do isn't to shout, but to stand by your choice. And if you've made it this far, support her with a like and share your experience if you've ever had to cut ties to breathe in peace. Your testimony may inspire someone who still doesn't dare. That simple invitation to conversation was, deep down, what she'd been missing all her life. Someone who saw her beyond comparison. Someone who said, "Here you are, and that's enough." Sarah's days began to fill with routines that felt like small victories. Quiet breakfasts on the terrace with David, uninterrupted afternoons of reading, Sunday movie nights with old blankets and freshly popped popcorn. They were simple gestures, but each one carried the weight of what had been achieved. Being able to live without anyone measuring her worth or comparing her accomplishments. They invited friends and neighbors over, and laughter mingled with the smoke from the grill in the garden. In those moments, Sarah understood that the true revenge for years of invisibility wasn't resentment, but the serenity of knowing she was recognized in her own space. The memory of the wedding was no longer an open wound, but a milestone transformed into a driving force. For some, it had been a family scandal. For Sarah, it was the day she stopped being invisible. When someone asked her for advice on how to handle a toxic relationship, she would often repeat, "It's not about winning arguments. It's about not losing yourself." That phrase became her compass, a constant reminder of where the line lay between love and annulment. Saying it out loud, she felt the girl with the rusty bike finally find a worthy response. Meanwhile, the news about Emma and her father came in an increasingly somber tone. Mounting debts, abandoned projects, fleeting jobs that didn't last more than a few weeks. The neighborhood, which had once treated them with respect, now viewed them with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Emma remained convinced that the world owed her something, and her father worked like a slave to sustain that illusion. Sarah listened to these stories without letting them drag her down. They were echoes of a past that no longer belonged to her. She understood that indifference could also be a form of freedom. One autumn afternoon, while collecting dry leaves from the garden, she thought of the phrase she had repeated so many times. Some bridges, once burned, are better left in ashes. And remembering it, she didn't feel harsh, but rather relieved. It wasn't about holding a grudge, but about accepting that certain relationships could only exist in ruins, and that rebuilding them would mean hurting each other again. In that recognition, she found peace, and in peace, a future without the shadow of the past. For the first time, she understood that closing chapters isn't about forgetting, but rather about ceasing to live in them. Sarah and David's house began to fill with photos of themselves. Simple trips to the coast, impromptu dinners with friends, small celebrations that held more value than any lavish event. None of them included their father or Emma, and that absence didn't hurt. It freed up space for new memories. Their mother appeared in some, always discreetly, with a smile that seemed to ask for forgiveness without needing words. Sarah understood that, even if she couldn't erase what she'd experienced, she could choose which memories to hang on her walls. And on those walls, she was, finally, at the center of her own story. Over time, she stopped checking her family's social media accounts, answering inconclusive calls, and searching for explanations in a dry well. She learned that life doesn't always offer justice, but it does offer the opportunity to choose who to walk with. Together with David and her close circle, she created a new chosen family, woven with mutual respect and shared laughter. Marriage, far from remaining a bitter scar, became the story that closed a dark period and opened a bright one. Sarah understood that she couldn't change her childhood or erase the absences, but she could decide that her future wouldn't be written in the same ink, and that choice, serene and firm, was the true act of overcoming. The years passed, and stability became a habit. Sarah no longer expected birthday messages from her father or was surprised by Emma's silence. Her world was made up of her own choices, a job that motivated her, a home full of life, and simple projects like planting a garden or redecorating the living room with refurbished furniture. Every achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated by those who truly loved her. Satisfaction no longer depended on elusive applause, but on the certainty of having built something authentic. Emma, on the other hand, remained trapped in the same web. She changed jobs like changing shoes, took out loans she never repaid, and posted carefully edited photos on social media to give the appearance of a life she didn't have. Her father, tired and in failing health, became her shadow, working tirelessly to sustain a mirage that no one else would buy. A society that had once admired their supposed brilliance now saw them as an example of how favoritism destroys from within. Sarah, upon hearing this news, no longer felt anger, not even sadness. It was like hearing a distant echo in a tunnel she'd emerged from long ago. She'd learned that some wounds, when they heal, don't erase the mark, but they do stop hurting. The important thing wasn't what she'd lost, but what she'd decided to gain: peace, respect, and the freedom to write her own destiny. She'd finally understood that breaking ties wasn't an act of cruelty, but of self-love. Her mother, little by little, found a sober place in her life. She visited from time to time, asking about the rose bushes in the garden or Sarah's new work project, and she did so without intruding, with a late-learned but genuine respect. These visits, far from opening old wounds, served to show that change was possible, though never perfect. Sarah valued these gestures because, while they couldn't rewrite the past, they did demonstrate that at least part of her family had chosen to learn. One evening, while having dinner with David and a group of friends in the garden lit by string lights, Sarah raised her glass and felt a profound calm. She didn't think about what she was missing, but about all she had managed to build. She looked around and recognized herself in every smile, in every uncontested conversation, in every detail of a home where no one was invisible. It was at that moment that she knew she had come full circle, from the forgotten girl to the woman in control of her life. Looking back, Sarah didn't see ruins, but ashes that had nourished fertile soil. She couldn't replace the rusty bicycle, the ignored grades, or the empty seat at her graduation. But she could decide what to do with that pain. She chose to turn it into a driving force, a foundation, a momentum. And in doing so, she stopped being the invisible daughter and became the woman who chose her own life. Her story wasn't a perfect tale, but it was hers. And in that belonging lay the greatest victory, having transformed humiliation into freedom and freedom into peace.